Welcome to a special Navigating Net Zero mini-series. Navigating Net Zero in Focus, Developments in Climate Standards and Guidance. In this mini-series, your host Alexia Kelly sits down with the leadership of many of the foremost climate accounting and reporting bodies to get the latest on this fast-moving, sometimes confusing space. Together, they get to the bottom of what each of these standards does, what they're doing to rise to the moment, and why it's so important to get all of this right. Thanks for joining us. Let's dive right in.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm Alexia Kelly, your host here at Navigating Net Zero, the podcast where we talk about what's working, what's not, and what's next on our global journey to net zero. I am delighted to be joined here today by my longtime good friend and colleague, the amazing Kim Carnahan, who leads the Center for Green Market Activation. Kim, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So Kim and I have worked together almost our entire careers. Kim has nearly 20 years of experience in climate change, including a decade at the U.S. State Department, where she managed the team that negotiated the Paris Agreement and its implementing guidance, as well as climate change agreements at the International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO, which you'll probably hear us reference, and the International Maritime Organization, IMO. An expert in carbon markets, greenhouse gas accounting, and alternative fuels, Kim spearheaded the launch of the Sustainable Aviation Buyers Alliance, also known as SABA, in 2021. She founded the Center for Green Market Activation in 2024, which continues to support SABA and the Zero Emissions Maritime Buyers Alliance, known as ZEMBA, while also developing book and claim systems and buyers alliances for heavy-duty trucking, cement, concrete, and chemicals. GMA also acts as the Secretariat for the Advanced and Indirect Mitigation Platform, which is the standard that we're going to be talking about here today in this mini-series, that aims to fill a gap in the greenhouse gas accounting and target setting landscape. Since 2022, AIM has been developing a new standard and guidance that enables companies to identify decarbonization investments that qualify as, quote, associated with value chain. It helps us assess their quality, account for and report their impact, and works in collaboration with a variety of other standard setting bodies and entities, including the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and the Science Based Targets Initiative. Just in full disclosure, I am a board member of the Center for Green Market Activation and also on the governing committee of the Advanced and Indirect Mitigation Standard. And so really excited to be here today because it's been a big week for the standard setting work that Kim has been leading more broadly. Kim, great to have you here.
Yeah, it's awesome to be here. Thanks a lot.
So tell me a little bit, before we dig into AIM, I would love to hear a little bit about the origin story of GMA and how you decided to launch a new nonprofit focused specifically on what is a pretty niche topic, but one that's critically important to the broader decarbonization trajectory.
I guess you can't talk about how I made the decision to launch GMA without getting into SABA and what came before it. And then also what came before that was my time at the State Department. And I guess kind of if you run through the State Department days really quickly, one of the things that I negotiated while I was there, as you mentioned in your intro, was the CORSIA deal, the International Civil Aviation Organization's kind of global deal on aviation emissions. And that was finalized in 2016. And I had kind of managed that process for the US government all the way through. Once we were finished with CORSIA, I realized that there was still a pretty big gap in what was happening to decarbonize aviation. That I was talk to airlines every day, and they would tell me that there was no interest in supporting sustainable aviation fuel among their customers. And then I would talk to a bunch of customers and they would say, we are desperate to support sustainable aviation fuel and decarbonize our use of business travel or air freight. But there's no way to do so. So it was pretty obvious to me while I was still at state that there was a gap there that needed to be filled. I knew very little about corporate accounting at that point. I had really, as you know, been more of a country's girl. So when I left the State Department and joined NG Impact as a kind of internal and external consultant for NG Group on sustainability, I was given some time by my supervisor there to explore this concept of how can we fill this gap and help companies who want to decarbonize their use of air travel and air freight to do so. And that led me to partner with the amazing Kelly at the Environmental Defense Fund, or who was then at the Environmental Defense Fund, And we then brought in RMI as well, and we launched the Sustainable Aviation Buyers Alliance back in 2021. SABA was kind of a surprising hit, I would say. There was a lot of clear need and demand for both a book and claim system for sustainable aviation fuel, as well as for a group that kind of brought companies together and helped them navigate the world of supporting SAF, which was not their area of expertise. So we had some pretty quick interest. We did a first pilot procurement that was a relatively small amount. And our first pilot procurement for SABA, it was only 7 buyers, and we, raised less than $20 million. In our second fund full scale procurement, we had about 20 buyers and raised about $400 million. So a pretty quick uptick as soon as folks realized what they were able to do working through us. And um, there was just a lot of interest in taking that model to other sectors, and that's what led us to launch GMA a couple of years later.
So tell me a little more about just this market making function that SABA and GMA are playing, because it's a really important kind of missing piece in the link of getting a lot of these early technologies from early technology stage pulled through to the market. But it's also, I think, an undervalued and under-recognized sort of set of skills and capacities that need to be brought to the market to help unstick them and really get them to scale. So the sub has been an amazing example, I think, of when this really works. But tell us a little bit more about the theory of change behind capacitating resources to help facilitate these market making activities.
Yeah. Well, it might be useful to start kind of with why there was this demand from corporates in the first place. Of course, in the wake of the Paris Agreement, there was really groundswell of enthusiasm from companies for climate action. We saw the advent of the Science Based Targets Initiative and really a huge rise in companies who were taking on ambitious climate targets that included their supply chain emissions, so their scope 3 emissions, which seems great. But the scope 3 inventory, as currently defined by the G2 protocol, only allows companies to report emissions from their suppliers or their customers using either data like emission factors they receive from actual suppliers about things that they're purchasing, or default emission factors combined with known purchase volumes. And what we were seeing is there was a lot of situations in that aftermath of the Paris Agreement where companies were trying to meet their SBTs, and they simply could not impact emissions in their value chain. So they could not actually address those physical emissions directly, either because they didn't have a good or influential relationship with their supplier, or the suppliers were not able to reduce the emissions from the products that they bought from them. The technology wasn't available, for example, to the actual suppliers they were using, or that supplier did not actually control the part of the production process that was responsible for the bulk of the emissions from that product. And so, because they weren't able to actually reduce their suppliers' emissions, they were stumped. And what SABA does and what the other programs that we run at GMA does is it kind of short circuits that system a little bit for them. Um, Book and claim systems decouple the environmental attribute from the physical good or service. And so companies can continue to operate their, for example, travel system, however they operate it today, but then they can, on the side, buy SAF certificates. And SAF certificates are basically the environmental attributes or emissions benefits associated with sustainable aviation fuel, kind of translated into an emission factor plus, an amount of SAF, it's physical SAF. So it's a way to allow companies to buy or support SAF without physically taking control of it, because most of the time they don't buy and sell fuel.
Yeah. And for our listeners who are maybe familiar with carbon markets but less familiar with book and claim systems, how are they similar and how are they different?
I mean, they're similar in a lot of ways. I think there's a couple of things. One is that the book and claim systems are sector specific. And so they're designed to meet the specific needs and kind of makeup of a particular sector, and a particular good or service that is being decarbonized. So, that's one thing is it's only about decarbonizing the aviation sector, for example, or only about decarbonizing cement and concrete. And then the units that we use, at least at GMA, are all what may kind of colloquially be referred to as attributionally accounted for, rather than buying an amount of emission reductions. You're actually purchasing the environmental attributes associated with a particular volume of the good or service. And that volume of good or service comes with an emission factor. So it's a way of accounting that fits more cleanly into the current kind of GHG protocol aligned emissions inventory. But of course, you can also translate that emission factor, combined with a volume of good or service into an emissions reductions as well, if you know what the kind of baseline was in your inventory to start with.
Yeah. Great explanation. And so SABA is up and running, things are going well. What happened next?
Well, almost from the very beginning, some of the most active companies in SABA were saying to me, we really need to do this in other sectors. Aviation is not the only play. Aviation was what I knew well at the time, aviation and maritime from my time at State Department. But the problem was not only affecting aviation, it was across sectors. So the next thing that we did was partnered with a couple of philanthropies, but Bezos Earth Fund is the one that provided us the kind of seed funding to launch the 501(c)(3) that became the Center for Green Market Activation. Partner with philanthropies to get a new NGO off the ground that would focus specifically on the kinds of things that SABA does, replicating the SABA model in other sectors, and specifically starting with hard to abate sectors. So we had already begun working with the Zero Emission Maritime Buyers Alliance, which was launched by the Aspen Institute. So we were supporting them back of house with all their technical work, given the work that we had done in SABA. But we decided we wanted to take this model and apply it also to heavy duty trucking. Was the next and most obvious one that we wanted to apply it to. Also applied it to cement and concrete. And now we kind of have a dual program in the chemical space, high value chemicals, and then also fertilizer slash green ammonia. So those are the sectors that we're working on now. And we have an emerging initiatives program, and so I wouldn't be surprised if we add a couple of additional sectors in the kind of next year or two.
So talk me through a traditional kind of deal flow from GMA's perspective, either, aviation fuel or heavy duty trucking. What exactly do you do at each step of the process and how does that work?
Well, I usually describe it as kind of our work is split into two buckets. The first is kind of the infrastructure development and refinement bucket of work that we do. For most of these sectors, there has never been anything like a book and claim system for that specific sector yet. So we work with other nonprofit partners. For example, on SABA, I mentioned we work with RMI and EDS, and we designed the book and claim system. So we actually developed the rule book for what can be booked and how it can be transferred from one party to another within a digital registry. So all of the rules related to that. And then also we work with external software providers and again other nonprofit partners to design and stand up the registries. We also work to develop sector specific accounting guidance if that's needed. And in most cases, it is. The same thing for sector specific verification guidance as well. So a lot of the time that hasn't yet been developed. And so we will either do it ourselves or partner with other nonprofits to do that. And then we also do a lot of work on contracts. So developing template contracts that both can be used in the procurements we then manage as well as by anyone who's interested in contracting for the types of goods and services that we're supporting the uptake of. So that's bucket one, that's infrastructure. And then bucket two is demand aggregation and procurement. And that's where kind of our buyers alliances fit in. We go out into the world and we try to find companies who have a need for what we do. And what we do is, well, manyfold. We design procurement processes based on the needs of the members. But we will go to the members and say, how much SAF, for example, are you interested in supporting this year or every year? Ideally, we're doing multi-year bids or multi-year procurements. So for the next 5 years, how much SAF are you interested in supporting? And then we aggregate those numbers that we get from all of our buyers into a single collective procurement process. We issue the RFP on behalf of our members. We receive the proposals back. Sometimes at the beginning, we have to go out and find the suppliers as well and educate them about the process, what it is, what it is, what is an EAC, what is a book and claim system, and convince them to bid because at least for that first pilot, they're not sure that what we're doing is real. But after the first one, they realized, oh, that was many millions of dollars, and that could have been, could have flown to my company instead of to another one. And so by the second procurement, we usually have a much larger number of suppliers bidding in. We evaluate the bids, vet them, do quite a bit of due diligence, both on the technical specs of whatever the offering is, as well as the financials of the company itself. And we choose a winner and we negotiate contracts on behalf of our members. And then our members bilaterally execute those contracts with the winning bidder or bidders in the case of us needing more than one to satisfy our demand. So it's a real kind of full service shop. We actually also follow the contracts all the way through delivery. And if it's a multi-year deal, we will follow it through, the 5 to 10 years of delivery that may be included. So it's again, a full service shop whereby we try to take all of the as much of the work as possible, and certainly anything that a company wouldn't normally know because, again, they're trying to decarbonize their suppliers, not themselves in this instance. So they're not jet fuel experts or heavy duty trucking experts or concrete experts. So we are that for them. And then, of course, we bring the kind of environmental nonprofit stamp as well, which we're very proud of.
Yeah, and I think just as a former corporate buyer, navigating the sea of people who are knocking on your door constantly trying to sell you various goods and services and products to decarbonize your supply chain is almost impossible to keep up with, along with all of the internal stakeholder management you're doing as a senior sustainability leader and trying to think through, okay, how do I manage the accounting and the reporting and working with finance? And so this benefit that these types of sort of market making, buyer aggregation products offer are really invaluable. It helps reduce risk. It helps companies diversify their supplier pools. It brings all the due diligence benefits that you're talking about and that additional expertise, which typically speaking, you're not going to have as a 1 or 2 person shop or even as a 20-person shop. I know you worked with some of the largest and most sophisticated buyers in this space, including Microsoft and Meta and Amazon. And so tell us a little bit about, from their perspective, like that additional value proposition that these types of models bring.
From the perspective of the big guys, like you said, even they don't, they have teams of people, but they still don't have the kind of depth of experience and exposure to the market that we do, especially after we've run several procurements. We've really seen bids from everyone who's out there. Running these procurements enables us to draw in as more data than anyone has at the moment, and that means that we could be quite sure we're getting a very good price. We cannot guarantee any particular price, but it is, you know, companies know they're competing for the most demand that's out there on the market. And so they're going to be giving us a very competitive price. And then a lot of these companies also really love working with their peers. They recognize that even they alone cannot move the needle as much as, Amazon can move the needle and not a lot, but not as much as if they're also working with Microsoft and Meta and Google, all of which are members of different GMA programs. And so if they're all working together, then they can, not just get one new plant to FID, which is very important, but they can help get the next several plants of a particular, good or service off the ground. And that actually starts to activate a market, to come back to the GMA's name. When you have multiple plants being triggered, multiple plants hitting FID, kind of year after year, thanks to these collective procurements, then that can really be a catalyst.
Totally. I think the other big benefit for this is the ability to go upstream, right? So right now a lot of the accounting systems really push companies downstream to focus on lots of small, highly disparate and disaggregated emission sources throughout their supply chain. And what these types of vehicles do is enable you to go up and really think about where are our biggest levers for impact in a particular sector and how do we mobilize finance so that we can build out that sectoral transformation as opposed to chasing tiny little matching initiatives all the way down, deep, 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 deep down in your supply chain. and often for suppliers that change, right? Or to your point, you don't have access to, you don't have visibility into. So that upstream transformation, I think, is often sort of a missed part of the broader theory of change we're trying to advance in this space that I think is super, super important. Are you guys seeing that play out?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the benefit of what we do is we can actually help companies with both. So, and I know we're going to get to the AIM standard, but kind of one of the underlying principles of the work that we did was whatever we design has to be practical enough to enable companies to invest enough and to invest at scale, right? Because that's where the real change happens is when companies can invest at scale. So it has to be practical, but we also deeply support this kind of the underlying principle that companies need to take responsibility for the emissions that underlie their business model. And so enabling them to do both of those things at the same time is where, kind of where we think the sweet spot is. And when I said it works for companies, and it works for companies that chase the tail. So for example, there are a lot of companies we work with on cement and concrete right now who do not have huge emissions in cement and concrete, but they like the idea. They know they're high emitting, they know they're hard to abate, and if there is a way, any way for them to address those emissions, they're happy to, but they don't directly buy cement and concrete. And so with our system, they can actually tell us, we want to buy 1,000 tons a year. We're happy to help them buy 1,000 tons a year. That means 1,000 tons of, emissions related to cement and concrete have been abated. And that's actually rather easy for them to do through the systems that we design. Now, it also enables companies who have, let's go to something that's much more disparate, ethylene. So ethylene is one of the pilots that we're working on now for one of our chemical programs. Um, Ethylene is in everything. And there's no way that you can go through your inventory and like have a partnership with each and every supplier that whose product contains ethylene to decarbonize ethylene. So what both GMA through the ethylene program as well as the AIM platform through the guidance it's provided allows companies to do is aggregate all of the ethylene within emissions factors in their inventory and do one big buy through GMA to address those emissions from ethylene. And it's not a like there's literally no choice. There's no way in which a company would go through and address ethylene any other way. So either it's not getting addressed or it's getting addressed through the kind of system that we've designed through GMA. And I think that's, it's helpful with this kind of system is helpful for those super upstream emissions that you just really could have no way to address otherwise. Those are also the hardest, unfortunately, to get companies to spend money on. So if anybody listening is interested in decarbonizing ethylene, please give us a call because it's not nearly as sexy as decarbonizing, business travel. But it is incredibly important that we decarbonize those chemical emissions.
So tell me how that then led to the need to develop the AIM standard and sort of what that process and journey looked like for you as you were building from all of these successes, getting these early stage deals off the ground.
Basically, the AIM platform came out of me knocking my head against a wall many, many times after having conversations with different folks who were interested in decarbonizing their use of aviation. They desperately wanted to, they had a goal, they had budget, but they didn't know how they were going to report what they bought from us. There wasn't a place to report it in their GHG protocol aligned inventory. And they didn't know if it was going to count towards a science based target or any other target they had set. And so companies were very clearly stating to me over and over again that they would love to invest in decarbonizing these hard to abate sectors, but they absolutely were not going to do so unless they could do it for a reason, which, to publicly claim it, to hit a target that they had set, which is very rational of them. And so I started talking to other folks. At that time, I was heavily in the fuel space. But I started talking to, for example, Owen Hewlett over at Gold Standard, who is really an ag expert, which I am not. And then started talking to Verena Radulovic over at C2ES and many others. I'm sure I had many conversation with you, Alexia, at that time about the same problem. Um, and everyone was saying the same thing. There is this huge gap in the GHG accounting and standard setting landscape right now that is truly holding up investment in decarbonizing, in particular hard to abate sectors, but really across the board in value chains. And so that's what led us to launch the AIM platform and to have been working so diligently over the past over 2 years now to develop this standard is because we're desperate to be able to achieve more impact, and we can't unless companies know that it's going to count towards something.
Yeah, and I remember when we were first talking about the need for AIM, we were like, "Oh, it'll take a year. We'll get a bunch of smart people in a room and get this knocked out." Here we are. The AIM standard just released yesterday. Hooray!
Yes.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
I hope you popped
I'm
the
so
champagne.
relieved. Yes,
Yes, I
definitely.
think we all are. But tell me a little bit about that sort of journey of getting the standard up and, undertaking writing a new standard is no small feat, particularly on top of actually trying to do real work in the real world. And so tell us a little bit about that journey and how that all came together.
It came together in fits and starts, I guess, because like you said, at first we were like, we'll do something quick and dirty that companies can use in the meantime until GHG protocol and Science Based Targets Initiative kind of revises their own standards and fills in this gap that, to be clear, they also recognized. And we had many conversations with SBTI and GHGP before we launched AIM, making sure they knew we weren't trying to to fill their shoes. We were really trying to do a couple of things. One, move faster than we knew they could, and then two, probably go a lot more deeply on the kinds of things that we were working on than they could, because they simply didn't have the practitioner expertise that we have because of the GMA programs and that Gold Standard has and that C2ES has from all of its work with companies. So we wanted to be able to go faster and go deeper than what they were going to be able to do. Um, but we also thought it would be a lot faster than it was. And from the very beginning, when we started putting out, like we start at the very beginning, we just put out a set of criteria. And we never thought that was going to be the whole standard, but we thought this would give us, if we put it out for public comment, it would give us a sense of, were we on the right track or not? And what we got back was just this overwhelming message of we need so much more detail than this. We don't just need we don't just need this fleshed out. We need, a full, 5 chapters for every single criteria to explain to us how we can apply it. And I think for me, that was actually really shocking because I thought companies wanted something simple. And of course they would everybody wants something to be as simple as it can be. But when it really comes down to it, companies want clarity. They want to be sure that they're doing the thing that's going to count, that they're not going to be criticized for it, that they're going to be able to say with certainty when they're going up their chain and arguing to their CEO and CFOs that this investment is going to matter. And, there's not going to be a Guardian article written about how they were, quote unquote, greenwashing. They really want that certainty. And that comes with detail. And so when we went back to the drawing board after those first criteria were released, we dug in, and every single time we released a first draft or a revision of what we were working on, we got the same comments. But what about this specific situation? Or so much more requests for detail, and so it turned into a pretty long standard in the end. We also are going to continue putting out sets of guidance that are like, for example, how is this complementary to what SBTI is expected to release in June? Making very clear how they work together and how you can use our standard with theirs. Same thing with as GHG protocol continues to move its process forward, though it's a much longer timeline, as you know. We'll be putting out blogs and communications that explains how this does or does not work with what we've done. So we're really all about usability, usefulness. If we are not being useful, then what was the point of all of it? And that's why ended up piloting the AIM standard and guidance with over 30 global companies, really huge companies with lots of different types of mitigation actions that they were undertaking, from ag all the way through to the heaviest of industries, companies who are working with their suppliers but still couldn't get something reported in their physical inventory, all the way to companies who are working with companies they'd never met before beginning this pilot. So every type of example we have tested, but we'll keep doing it to make sure that the standard is as useful as possible.
I think it's such a difficult balance to strike as an environmental regulator, right? Is you want to be sort of universally applicable, but high environmental integrity and easy to interpret and standardize, but also able to accommodate the almost infinite variety of circumstances that you have in the real world. And I think, every time we would get a new case or issue or example, you really do when you're writing a standard have to think through, okay, what does this mean? How does it work? Do we need to change the guidance to address this? And I think on the one hand, that's really good, but I think it's also super challenging because you're never going to be able to write a guidance that comprehensively covers every possible implementation circumstance. And just getting that level of detail where you're netting out the stuff that you really don't wanna be happening, where the people are greenwashing or just writing the rules, and I know, we had a big conversation about third-party verification over the course of AIM and, like, what is the role of third-party verification, and how do we think about that and or not? And so maybe just say a few words about that because I think especially for insetting and supply chain tied decarbonization activities where the market is very young, people are really just doing this for the first time. There was a really active debate about is it reasonable to require a third party verification in this very nascent set of implementation circumstances and what does that mean for how the market evolves moving forward?
Yeah, I think you're definitely right that there's always that tension between, being absolutely certain that what is being issued is what the system says is being issued versus or what is being reported is actually what the atmosphere saw. There's that tension between that and wanting to release, unleash climate finance to do as much good as possible. I'm hopeful that we have threaded that needle as well as it can be threaded, but I have no doubt that we will be criticized on both sides of the issue. Um, and I think what it comes down to is you and I were both in the early stages of the carbon market, the kind of traditional offset space. Working in that space, at least for made me reluctant to cut too many corners just because we really want to learn the lessons from the past. And so there certainly will be plenty of mitigation actions that companies would like to do that will not pass the AIM standard. But I also think there's a whole lot that will be. And in particular, we've tried our best to provide avenues that really opens the floodgates for investing in particular, those hardest to abate sectors, which have seen little to no investment to date. So I guess we have really swung with the AIM platform and the work we've been doing. The pendulum has swung a little bit from a focus on finding the most economical ways to decarbonize, which is very important. But that's not what we're about. We're about finding ways to address the emissions that underlie companies' value chains and that are in their supply chains that they're not addressing now. And in order to do that, you have to address the hard to abate emissions. You can't just address the thing that's the easiest or the cheapest to do. We should also be doing that. But AIM was focused more on providing an avenue for the latter.
And I think one of the things we're hoping to do with this mini season is really help listeners understand kind of how all of these different standards fit together, right? So the greenhouse gas protocol obviously provides the guidance for how you account and report for your corporate greenhouse gas inventory. AIM standard is very specific to addressing mitigation actions that you implement that are associated with your value chain and how you report those. And TCAT, the Task Force for Corporate Action Transparency, covers off all three scopes and the full range of mitigation action. So all of those things. The goal, though, as you noted earlier, is really to bring those together. So maybe talk a little bit more both about how you guys are engaging with the JGP update process and what that looks like and where you see that headed, I think, and the importance and role of multi-ledger reporting across all of these issues.
Yeah. Well, maybe, can kind of touch on all three of you mentioned GHGP and TCAT, and there's also SBTI. And what we're trying to do is for GHGP, almost like be their, we were their advance. And with SBTI, so to speak, we have already developed a multi-ledger reporting system for scope 3. And for SBTI and GCP are both developing eligibility requirements, for like kind of quality requirements for what can be reported either in the inventory or towards a target. And we have already done that for scope three, mitigation actions as well. And so we're trying to be their advance, having already done it, bringing everything we've learned into those processes and hopefully informing them and influencing them, um, as they're moving forward. For TCAT, my understanding is that, the AIM aligned, kind of AIM associated or AIM compliant emissions benefits that companies are reporting would have a clear place to be reported under TCAT as well. And so if companies were trying to meet that particular level of rigor, then they would be able to do so and report as such under TCAT. So ideally, we kind of slot in to all three of those. For GHGP and SBTI, I would note we're likely to provide more guidance than what they have in their finished drafts. They, simply because they don't um, I don't think they foresee, and as being a participant in their processes, I haven't seen that they would ever get into the level of detail that we get into, which you could say leaves open a lot of room for interpretation. And certainly companies can interpret what they write however they want. We're hopeful that they will, and we have heard from them that they would prefer to not have to interpret actually in most cases. And so if we are either through something we put out after those two bodies release their guidance, um, or something we develop together with them, our goal will be able to say, if you're trying to figure out how to meet that requirement in GHGP, follow this part of AIM, right? Or, if you follow AIM, if you're AIM compliant, then you just do meet that. And you don't need to worry anymore about what all of those things mean because we're telling you that this is compliant with that. And we will provide more details so companies will have less questions that they still have to answer at the end for themselves. So that's the goal there, is to actually go deeper on purpose. Again, because that's the feedback we got from companies, is they preferred more guidance rather than less.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I was quite surprised, especially coming from, many years working at the UN and really thinking about what are international rule sets and what do those look like for implementation of a wide range of mitigation actions at the country level, sort of moving into this new space where there really was almost no guidance when we started a lot of this work in 2020. Filling that gap, I think, is really important. From your perspective, in terms of kind of where the field is going, obviously there's a huge amount of fragmentation right now in the standard setting space. Like, what would success look like in 2 years or 5 years?
Well, I keep saying I would like for AIM to go away, but for it to not be needed anymore because kind of the powers that be, in particular SBTI and GHGP, have filled all the gaps. I don't know that that's going to be the case, but I do think that in 2 years from now we'll at least have a landscape that is, more than is set, because GHGP is not supposed to finalize its actions and market instruments standard until 2028, according to their current schedule. So yeah, that by that point, we'll know what is the reporting structure, what are the eligibility criteria for what can be reported in each place, and then also what can count towards an SBT. And then I imagine we'll also have, either an upswing in other target types. I would not be surprised if we see, more companies taking on non-SBTs in the future as well. But at least that landscape will be more set. Um, the future of AIM is past that 2-year period, I would say, is uncertain because it just depends on if we're still needed or not. And if we are still needed at that point, AIM might become its own, standalone nonprofit, as well, versus a kind of combined initiative of the three organizations that started it.
Yeah, and I certainly think we all hope for swift and rapid convergence, alignment, and harmonization across the existing standards. It's really hard for me to believe that it's 2026, right? We have literally been fighting over accounting rules for 6 years now, and this was supposed to be the critical decade for action. And so there's part of me that just feels so like,
Sorry,
you
I
know,
sighed so loud.
Well, it's really hard because I think, sometimes I feel like we're all sitting around twiddling our thumbs while Rome burns, and other times I think we're, the fire brigade, like, throwing our buckets of water on this raging inferno of the climate crisis and inaction, and so I think especially for those of us who are spending a lot of time in the standard setting and rule setting space, justifying the investment in trying to bring along functionally global consensus around what right looks like for this incredibly complicated set of topics, I think is both really important and also feels a little disheartening sometimes because it just feels like we're moving so slowly, even though we're all working so incredibly hard.
Yeah, and even when you think you're gonna be able to move fast, and we have within the AIM platform moved faster than SBTI and GHCP has been able to, but even when you think you're gonna be able to move fast, it just turns out that these things take quite a long time. But you're certainly preaching to the choir here. Every single time, and that still happens. It still happens every week to us that companies say, "Are you sure this is going to count towards my target? Because if not, I'm not going to spend." And it's a lot of money. We have companies spending, certainly, some of the bigger companies are spending not just tens of millions, they're spending hundreds of millions of dollars, every year through us, let alone what they're doing externally. And to to see that stifled in any way is the most frustrating thing by organizations that for sure are fully focused on, addressing climate change. Their entire raison d'etre is that they're trying to get companies to take responsibility for their emissions and to act on them. And so by no means do I think that there are bad actors in that kind of space that folks just have a different threshold for what good looks like. And for me, good looks like billions, if not trillions of dollars being invested in climate solutions. And if the reporting and the accounting is not perfect, I do not care. Like, you know, it needs to be good enough and it needs to ensure the companies are addressing the emissions that their business model requires. But beyond that, if the numbers are not perfect now, also there's a lot of false equivalence that happen, or false precision that happens in the space today, where companies will say, well, those aren't the exact emissions that are coming from their inventory. Well, guess what? A lot of their inventory emissions are made up right now. Like, the totals are not based on good data. And yes, we always need to be continuing to improve that data, but not instead of acting to address those emissions. If you have to choose between one or the other, address the emissions, fix the data later. And so I obviously share your frustration there.
Yeah, and I think this is actually one of the biggest misconceptions and frustrations that I have too in this broader space right now is that there's this sort of prevailing sense in the environmental community that if it's in your inventory, it's a real emission and it's somehow sacrosanct and it's, infallible and it is the ledger of truth and what the atmosphere is seeing. Anyone who's actually worked on a scope 3 emissions inventory knows that it is very, very, very far from that. Still a very useful instrument and tool. We need it. But this fallacy that we are frankly codifying now, that if it's in your inventory it's great and if it's outside of your inventory it's greenwashing garbage, is just such a huge problem. And I think I want to talk to you a little bit about the challenges I think we're facing in both reconciling the reality that you do not decarbonize scope 3 or scope 2 without market-based accounting. You just can't do it, right? Whether it's book and claim or utilization of emissions trading markets, whatever it is, like, it's a necessity because of the way that the emissions are actually emitted and they touch your supply chain. And I know, to your point about balancing the environmental impact and kind of efficacy threshold with movement, that's really hard because I think we all have some PTSD, right, from the first time we did this in the carbon markets and frankly are still doing it, right? And just that continuous improvement and learning and frankly mistake cycle that we've been in the carbon market, I think created this sort of sense of like, oh my God, we have to get it perfect if we're going to use market-based accounting anywhere else. And that I think is a real just it's unfortunate because I think we've actually also missed opportunities to learn lessons from that last experience and really think about, okay, how do we build a system that is comprehensively good and aligned and interconnected across sectors and across interventions, as opposed to, reinventing the wheel for every new thing. So how are you guys thinking about that broader challenge? And does AIM help kind of cut across some of that sectoral disparity that we see?
Well, I mean, AIM covers mitigation actions regardless of the accounting approach used to quantify the benefits of the mitigation action. So I think that's important. A lot of I've gotten the question many times about whether or not AIM only covers book and claim systems, for example, or environmental attributes that are denominated in the kind of tons of product plus an emission factor. And the answer is no, because we don't think many, if not most, mitigation actions out there can in fact be accounted for that way. Or if they were accounted for that way, it would require so many steps to kind of back calculate what the kind of attributional accounting value would have been, that it's not worth it. So kind of traditional project-based accounting has to have a place from in my view, and definitely has a place under the AIM platform, because so many projects simply they are a better fit for project-based accounting than a product by product type of accounting method. And um, I think that's one area where the existing standards bodies are still, I would say it's one area that they're still grappling with. Yeah, whether or not project-based accounting is somehow less good, if it is less rigorous or less credible, it is just as credible and can be just as rigorous and just as good as attributional accounting with using emissions factors, from my view. And I mean, I've seen no kind of scientific reason for why it's not, but the association with kind of offsetting and the negative view that some have about kind of traditional offsetting have really colored, negatively, put a lens over project-based accounting, even when it's used in the best possible situations. I think that that's really frustrating. But AIM does not discriminate between type of accounting method, and the AIM standard covers both of them.
Yeah, that's great to hear, and I think both of them are more appropriate depending on what circumstances you're in, and sometimes they're great at doing one thing, and sometimes you really need another approach to do another thing, and so figuring out how we design a really comprehensive and rigorous set of rules that enable you to do the things you need to do in order to catalyze action should hopefully be all of our North Star, without getting into what has sort of become a, like, identity issue in the environmental movement, right? Like, I'm an attributional person or I'm a consequential person. Like, it just seems a little crazy to me. I mean, I hope that we can move towards a more nuanced understanding of, like, what does this really mean and look like, and what are the rule sets that are going to drive the most action and the highest integrity environmental outcome that we can deliver in the shortest period of time as our North Star.
Agreed. Yeah, and maybe there's one thing to go back just a minute ago, like this, you said market-based approaches are absolutely gonna be needed in order to hit Scope 3 targets or something like that. Uh, that it's so true. It is important to kind of double down on that, I think, because right now, or at least up until now, there was the assumption that if you just leaned enough on your suppliers, on your biggest suppliers in particular, that you could force them to decarbonize. And I just that is not true. um, it would only be true, and that if you did that, it would flow to your physical inventory, and then you wouldn't need market-based accounting. And it is not true for multiple reasons. It's not true because most companies do not have particularly influential relationships with even their tier one suppliers, and they may have 10,000 tier one suppliers. So the idea that you can systematically do that and have that influence is nonsense. B, the idea that those companies can even reduce the emissions they control the way you want them to is also, in many cases, not true. The technology that they need either is not feasible for them to use for some reason, or is not available for them to use for some reason. So either they may not even be able to operationally control the emissions you want them to. And then the third issue is, does what part of the value chain or supply chain they control even constitute a material amount of emissions? And in most cases, your tier one suppliers do not control the material emissions that have gone into that product. It is, in fact, one or more entities much further down the supply chain. So when you are faced with those three problems on top, the bulk of what you do to address your scope 3 emissions is not going to flow into your physical inventory, certainly not now, and probably not for a while. And in particular, not for those hard to abate sectors where the solutions are few and far between and available in very few places.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And I think that really came home for me when I was trying to decarbonize our productions at Netflix, right? And we were swapping out diesel vehicles for electric vehicles. But the emissions accounting and reporting systems that we had in place were not nearly granular enough to capture the emissions impact of those truck deployments. Like they just so we had to do basically an additional accounting exercise and a synthetic adjustment or a separate reporting table because SBTI didn't even have guidance on how I reported actions towards my target, which is, I think, both the impetus for AIM and the impetus for a lot of the guardrails and guidelines that we've been developing under TCAT is just how do you actually report in a transparent and robust way the impact of all of the mitigation actions that you're taking? Because in most instances, I would actually say they're not going to naturally show up in your greenhouse gas inventory accounting systems, almost across the board, even I think probably in scope 1. So that I think is going, that's something that I think people have yet to sort of grok in the way that we need them to.
They just think that all the companies are lazy and they're not trying very hard. And some companies are lazy and are not trying very hard.
Absolutely.
But the ones that are should at least get credit for it.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. Well, Kim, it's been such a pleasure to talk with you today. And I always like to end on a positive note. So what is getting you out of bed and keeping you motivated these days?
Besides my toddler,
Very early in the morning.
what gets me motivated is the fact that even in the current political climate, we still have a lot of companies interested in what we do, either from the standard side or from the kind of book and claim buyers alliance side. Every week, every day, we have inbounds from companies that we have not heard from before who are interested in our approach. It's not moving fast enough. They're not buying enough. But it's still moving forward and it has not fallen off a cliff the way that I think so many of us were terrified that it would be, especially in the United States. So that's my positive, my slightly positive thought of the moment is that things could be much worse.
Well, and I'll just say that I think one of the things that's really giving me hope is, the incredible success that both GMA and SABA and Zemba are demonstrating. Like you guys have been able to go from functionally zero, like markets that were at zero to like real hundreds of millions of dollars being mobilized into new technologies in hard to abate sectors. So that idea that you could solve a problem, I see a problem, build a coalition to solve the problem and actually deliver real outcomes on the ground in the period of 2 or 3 years is frankly remarkable and incredibly commendable. So congrats to you and the whole team. So Kim, tell us about the AIM standard, where it is, where it's going, and what's next.
Yeah, so the AIM platform standard and guidance was published on April 14th and is available now on the AIM platform website, aimplatform.org. Please go there, download it, read it, and then get in touch with us so that we can know that you're piloting it. We know dozens of companies are already doing so. And what is really important now is that companies use it and give us their feedback so that we can funnel that feedback into the processes that are underway under DHG protocol and SBTI and other bodies as well. So yeah, please go to the website and take a look. Thanks so much, Alexia.
Thanks for joining me, Kim.
That's a wrap on this special episode of Navigating Net Zero. If you enjoyed the conversation, please be sure to follow or subscribe, and help us spread the word by sharing this episode with your friends or colleagues. Thank you again for listening. Until next time, Take good care and keep up the fight.